Hi, Hernan. Thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to have your perspective, not just from as an entrepreneur and an investor, but also thinking about the critical junctions that are taking place for venture capital in emerging markets overall, but in particular in Latin America. So really excited to have you here, and thanks for making some time.
Thank you for inviting me, Juan. Pleasure to be here chatting with you.
So I think you spent a lot of time talking about your entrepreneurial experience. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that. One of the things people also, I think, forget is that you've also not only co-founded Mercado Libre, but also moved from being its COO to the CFO after the company went public, right? I'm really curious, what was that experience like for you and what led to that change?
It was a great experience, and it happened because who's today my co-founder at KASZEK, Nicolás Secasi, who had been the CFO, the original CFO of Mercado Libre all the way up until we became public. Once Mercado Libre was a Nasdaq company, he remained on board for probably an extra 2 years, and then he decided to leave. So I took his position. It was a great experience for me to move from COO to CFO and learn all the dealings that you have when you are a public company and when you have to deal with analysts and all that. I think was a great experience. I always say that if I had to pick one of those two positions for life, I would certainly remain with the COO position. But to have the experience of being the CFO of a publicly traded company is also, I think, adds a lot to the toolkit that, in particular, now I need as a venture capitalist.
So that's a good segue, and one of the things that was on my mind in your time when you were serving as CFO, was that part of the idea then about moving to a more of an investor role? Was that sort of one of the reasons I was continuing to build on that spark that you mentioned to become an investor, or how did just being in that role shape you for becoming an investor as well for the region?
When I moved from COO to CFO in Mercado Libre, that was because I found the new challenge really interesting, but also because that's how I felt that I could help the company more. So we wanted to have someone in the CFO position that could tell the story as an insider, and obviously I could do that. So that change in particular didn't have anything to do with my becoming later on a venture capitalist. I think the fact that I ended up moving to the investment sector was something that was cooking slowly during my tenure throughout the Mercado Libre experience, because during that time we learned that there were lots of opportunities to create value in Latin America through technology, and that all the secular trends that we were seeing at that time, more in the US and then in Asia, were going to happen also in the region. But we didn't have that many entrepreneurs, but more importantly, we didn't have venture capitalists, the
Right.
kind of VCs that you do have in the Silicon Valley, for instance. So in the case of Mercado Libre, we had different kind of investors, but most of those were kind of bankers trying to provide capital, and in some cases also trying to help with some professional advice, but they didn't have any particular tech experience, entrepreneurial experience. So their advice was somehow remote, and we thought that because we had an entrepreneurial experience quite relevant, we could help entrepreneurs better. So all that was cooking in the background, and then slowly but steadily I became more convinced that that was where I wanted to spend the next phase of my career, and that's how I ended up deciding to leave Mercado Libre and start KASZEK together with Nicolás Secasi, who was, as I said, the original CFO of Mercado Libre.
It's excellent. It's excellent to see how the entrepreneurial bug that bit you kept biting again as you wanted to do an even longer term enterprise with KASZEK. So I think that really puts you in a really great place to think about not just how to create and scale a large scale company, but also what it takes to sort of bring it public and do what VCs tend to call exits or liquidity events. So with valuations in Latin America and many other markets increasing year to year, and just the inflows of capital, the actual number of exits in Latin America or large exits is a little bit more limited today. I think you are perhaps Mercado Libre is still the benchmark of what the most successful exit looks like. So how are you thinking about exits in Latin America overall in KASZEK?
So obviously, at the end of the day, we're venture capitalists and we have investors and we want to return dollars or maybe liquid stocks to our investors. So at the very end of our journey, the exits are very relevant because we are early stage investors. We don't think that much about it at the very beginning. In the beginning, we just think about finding extraordinary entrepreneurs, going after very large markets, and we know that somehow, if those incredible companies can be built, then eventually exits will take care of themselves, right? And will come. But what's happening in Latin America, and I think you somehow implied that in your question, we're having a great evolution, but it's not an evolution that happened one day to the next. So things are happening sequentially. At the beginning, when we became VCs, the typical question was, but are you going to find enough startups where to invest your capital? And then once we demonstrated that, the question was, but then are you going to find investors to provide follow-on capital for your companies for the Series B, C, D? And today, probably the question that we're getting more and more is the one you asked, that is about exits. So I think it happened with the first two prior questions, answers will come very naturally. So when they were asking us, will you find entrepreneurs? We said yes. Entrepreneurs look for opportunities. We see a field totally open with many opportunities emerging. The entrepreneurs will realize that and will basically go after those big markets, big disruptions that were going to happen. And then eventually, if somehow good companies were being built, capital would come. If you had asked at the time, so where that capital will come exactly from, I had no clue. So maybe I could have said a couple of larger funds that were somehow active in the region, but my answer would have been quite limited in terms of names. Today, our company raised billions of dollars from all investors you can imagine. And I think exits will follow that. So for quite some time, Mercado Libre was the only publicly traded company. And every year we thought that, okay, next year we're going to have a few more, and that did not happen. And then we said, okay, the following year, and that did not happen either. But now it's happening. So you have like not only Mercado Libre, but you have PagSeguro, Stone, XP, Arco, a few other companies that are planning to go public. You have the local stock market in Brazil that has become quite open for smaller tech stories.
Mm-hmm.
You have some large M&A transactions. So, for instance, we sold Grupo SAP to OLX. So things are happening. Now you have SPACs that are exclusively focused on Latin America, and I'm sure that they will offer some extra liquidity. But the most important thing is that today global markets are open for Latin American companies. They have seen the Mercado Libre story, they have seen some other stories, and they believe that value can be created there. And today investors are global in nature. So if there's value, they will go. And I'm totally convinced that value is there. So what happened is what typically happens with technology.
Right.
You can dream of the future, and sometimes that dream happens slower than you imagined. But then when it ends up happening, it's much bigger than what you could have imagined in your most optimistic scenario. And I think that's exactly what's happening with technology in Latin America. We've been around now for 22 years, so we've seen it all. And at the beginning, there was no ecosystem whatsoever. And slowly but steadily, all the different pieces of that ecosystem started to appear. And today you have a very robust ecosystem. One that still has long way to go,
Room to
one
grow,
where
right?
there are some areas that need further development. And maybe one of those is the exits, but it's happening and it will happen very naturally.
So it's very interesting because if I recall well as well, when Mercado Libre was looking at exits, although I don't know if that was the right term, you mentioned, I think, there was the hope potential or the ambition was perhaps eBay will come and snatch us up at some point for the right price. And then, that didn't work out, but now there's a bit more of a focus on not just the strategic M&A, but also the pathway of listings and or SPACs. Venture capital, of course, is driven by these outliers. So in your portfolio, perhaps the vast majority won't have a hugely successful um, exits, but the ones that do will. And how are you sort of talking with the entrepreneurs that you work with about what are the kind of paths that might make the most sense for them based on what they're looking at, be it a strategic sale, something similar to eBay acquiring Mercado Libre, or going for a full-blown IPO or a SPAC acquisition? Like, how do you have these conversations? Where's your mind in these days?
So when we invest first in a company, what we have to believe in is that that company can be a fund maker for us. Fund maker is a company that just whatever we get back from that particular company can pay back the entire fund. So for that to happen, you need to have somehow relevant ownership in that company at the time of liquidity. And then also you have to imagine that that company can be quite sizable. So if you have, I don't know, 5, 10, 15% of the company, it can return you, like our last fund was close to 400 million. So if you want to get a $400 million check out of that company, the company needs to be quite sizable. So that's what we need to believe in. Implicit in that analysis is that we believe that that company can be a publicly traded company in Nasdaq or the New York Stock Exchange, so in a very relevant market where you can get those kind of valuations that we need. Obviously, we get that right a few times per fund, and then many other companies do not get there. And those, depending on the case, get acquired by strategic players, and that is fine. Some others may get some liquidity in local stock markets, so obviously the return is lower versus that fund making scenario that we imagined at the beginning. Obviously, in some other cases, companies do not make it, and we have to go through the hard way, and in particular, the entrepreneurs to shut down the companies. And then in some other cases, you have more irrelevant transactions of a company merging into another one, and those kind of things. So we have a little of everything, and those conversations do not happen at the beginning. Again, at the beginning, we're all dreaming about that big picture of everyone ringing the bell and producing a very successful IPO. But then, as maybe the company is doing well, but a strategic player preempts whatever move you may want to have in the financial markets, and if the founders are willing to sell instead of maybe waiting longer, putting some extra risk into the equation, but hopefully getting some more upside. And we feel that the founders are not there; they are more willing to sell rather than take the risk. At the end of the day, the founders are the ones that make the decision. We try to convince them, we try to show them what we had seen in other opportunities, but at the end of the day, you need the founders to be totally on board with what you want to do. And sometimes that is, no, let's wait and we want to go big or go home. And some others say,
Mhm.
you know what, I think this is a great outcome for us. So let's try to call it a day and close this transaction. So it's case by case. But again, the important thing is that at the beginning, we always dream for that big IPO.
It's always a category defining company or the potential for it that makes it for you. And I see that, and of course, these entrepreneurs are remarkable to slog through it. But now you've been at this for a decade, right? 10 years on the investor side. I don't know when the birthday is, but whenever it is, happy 10-year anniversary for KASZEK.
You know
Um,
how these things are. You don't have a very precise date when things get started, but we defined that as June 1st. So soon we will have the 10-year anniversary.
Looking forward to the 10 years, and it's also it's very opportune for the conversation we're having because some of your earlier investments, perhaps things from 7 years ago, from 5 years ago, are looking. You've of course already had exits, but are looking for what's the right way to create a liquidity event to go public, to be acquired. And you did mention the Brazilian uh, market, the Brazilian stock exchange in particular is also very extremely active. So a lot of Chinese firms have gone through the model of the dual listing, right? You list in Hong Kong and then you'll list in Nasdaq. I'm really curious if you have a perspective on whether that's a model that could also be relevant to Latin America. Outside of Brazil, most stock markets are a little bit smaller. Understandably, my native Bolivia stock market is quite small, let me put it nicely. But what do you think about the purpose, or what value would you see in doing a dual listing overall for some of the portfolio companies?
So what we learned with Mercado Libre and kept on confirming over the years is that the US market, in particular the technology US market, is really deep, and you have lots of great investors that understand technology, understand what are the sequences that you need to go through to evolve and progress with any business. They had seen maybe similar businesses in other countries. So it's incredible the amount of knowledge, obviously liquidity that you get in that market. So today, I have not seen a better market than the US market for the large companies that may emerge out of Latin America. So the Mercado Libres and the Pagseguros and the Stones and the XPs are all publicly traded in the US. Then, in some cases, if you want to have a local leg or something, you can do a dual listing. And in that case, you have two ways. One is you are a US publicly traded company, and then you have the BDRs that are stocks that can be acquired at the local Brazilian level, but it's a proxy of that equity that trades in the US. But sometimes they do the opposite, right? It's like
Mhm.
you become a publicly traded company in Brazil and you have your kind of securities traded in the US as proxies to those that you have in Brazil, which is the original market. Any of those work, but again, in our mind, I think that the US market is more developed, in particular for technology. So that should be the aspiration. Then whether you want to do a dual listing or not, it's up to you. It depends on what kind of shareholder base you want to build. And if there's a reason why you want to have maybe more Brazilian investors, that makes sense. And sometimes what may happen is the opposite. And it has happened
Hmm.
a few times. That is, you list initially in your local market, and the company keeps on doing well and grows and becomes more relevant. And they decide, you know what, we're happy with the performance we've had in the local market, but we want to reach out to more global shareholders, and they do the dual listing afterward in a more global market that it's typically the US, but could be a European market. And I think because of, I don't know, the cultural thing that has happened more with US or European markets and not so much in Asian markets. But I'm sure that we are going to see one day a company with a dual listing in an Asian stock market.
I think that's very exciting. And speaking of Asia and Southeast Asia, of course, extremely exciting business models taking place there. What I think we've seen actually the start of some Asian players or Southeast Asian players moving into Brazil. I believe Shopee has moved into Mexico or Brazil. How are you thinking about the entry of these new players from other geographies, and what that does for the Latin American ecosystem overall?
Yeah, that is certainly happening. I think it's great news. At the beginning, the companies, the global or international companies that were looking at Latin America were more American companies, maybe European companies. and there was a long tradition of different European or American businesses expanding into Latin America, but there was almost no experience with Asian companies. Now that is happening more and more. Obviously, Asia is a continent that has transformed itself big time over the last 20, 30 years. So now you have very relevant players there. They were a little bit slow because they had so many things to take care of in their local markets that the international expansion came later, but now it's happening. I think it's great, and we see that also in our LP base, our own investors in KASZEK. At the beginning, it was mainly US-based investors, and today we have a nice share of Asian investors that are looking into Latin America, that believe in the future of Latin America, that they are seeing some of the trends they saw in their markets, and they believe that having experienced that in first hand and now trying to replicate that in a different market like Latin America could work. And I think that's part of the case. Like if you look at technology in Latin America and anyway looking about the evolution, everything was happening week after week, month after month, year after year. Things were moving slowly up. Then I think mobile internet created the first big jump, similar to what happened in Asia, right? So
Right.
you move from lots of people not even having a computer at home all the way to being connected with relatively decent data plans 24 by 7. So that changed completely the landscape, and that accelerated big time the growth of many businesses and created a lot of the things we're seeing today. And now the second big accelerator was COVID, right? So COVID
Hmm.
was a tragedy for humanity, but in particular for the tech world, it's been an incredible accelerator. Things that probably would have happened, I don't know, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years from now are happening now because of that. So all that is happening, and the Asian players see that the kind of trajectory they saw in their markets will happen in Latin America. And also in terms of business models, at the beginning, the typical business models were more related or more correlated to what we are used to seeing in the US. And today you have a mix, right? So obviously we have a big influence from the US, Europe. So we may stick with some of those models, but then there are others, and because of the local needs, the solutions that have been found in Asia apply better. So this idea of I don't know, an open app that works on many aspects. If you look at the US, you typically have vertical apps, right? So this app is
Right.
great for this app great for that, and that was the model that worked in Latin America. Now you're starting to see kind of a hybrid model. You still have several apps that are more vertical in nature, but then you're also having more of those Swiss Army apps that do several things. So let's see where it ends. I think my guess is that it's going to be a hybrid model. So some things is going to be more similar to the US, some other things are going to be more similar to Asia. And importantly, what we're seeing in the region is that when we started investing in 2011,
Hmm.
most of the businesses were what is called a copycat. And again, I have a big respect for that. Some people look down to that term. We don't do that at all. I think it takes lots of challenges to be able to build a business successfully and adapt it to the region, etc. In a way, Mercado Libre was that initially.
Right.
Amazon and eBay were out there, and when we looked at that and somehow got inspired because of that. But then today, if you look at Mercado Libre, it's a company of its own and has innovated in many areas way beyond where eBay has innovated or where Amazon is. So clearly, the work you do, even if you start by copycatting someone,
Yeah.
it's incredible the amount of innovation that goes into place. But it's true that initially, we in that first portfolio, we could have said, okay, this is the whatever of Latin America, this is the whatever of Latin America. And now we see many businesses that are created because the entrepreneurs were frustrated with a particular problem they were experiencing in Latin America, and they created a solution to solve that problem. And sometimes that is a problem that applies only to Latin America, but
Right.
just by solving it, you can really create a large company. Sometimes then they realize that, oh, look, this is also a problem that seems to be, I don't know, relevant in Europe. Let's go to Europe. Or sometimes what we start to see is, oh, companies in Germany or the UK saying, I want to build the new bank of Germany, the new bank of the UK. And that is exactly the opposite of what used to happen 10 years ago. So clearly, the whole ecosystem has evolved in all its different angles.
And it's extremely exciting because even if you do a quote copycat model and you replicate the business model, you still have all the execution risks that come to bear in
Totally.
Latin America. And that is in many cases actually the majority of the challenges there. So for those bits for those models, you still have to execute, and ultimately execution is winning. I believe Rocket Internet's founder has that as a mantra, and that's how they outperformed is by building by out executing all the others, even though the business models were relatively related. So it's good to see how that plays out. So even within Latin America, though, there are big differences. Like Brazil is a different beast than Colombia, and Colombia is a different beast than in Mexico. And so there's two questions I want to ask. How do you think about when is the right time for one of your companies to move beyond their domestic market? And then the second one that we'll go into more detail is, are you considering also any companies that it's not they're going to be regional players, but might be global players? So they might start in Brazil and then move to Nigeria before expanding in Africa. So first question, how do you think about the differences within Latin America when you look at these companies? And the second question is, are you considering also companies that will be world dominant and that will play in other markets, play in Africa, play in Asia, etc.?
Those are great questions. The way we look at Latin America is that it's not one big country. It's a collection of many countries where, in general, I think there are lots of commonalities. So typically, if you find one problem in one country, then you look at the neighboring country and the same problem is relevant. And the way to address it is somehow similar. Sometimes we get asked that question from global investors, and we tend to look at Latin America, again, different countries, but probably those countries are closer to each other than, I don't know, European countries, where their cultural differences are sometimes more relevant. So, but having said that, you need to be aware of those differences. And in some cases, it's easier to build a regional presence. So if you are talking about, I don't know, a software that connects buyers and sellers, maybe that software is relevant throughout the region. Obviously, you need to adapt it because in each country you need local buyers and local sellers, but it's more kind of it's easier to expand pieces of software. When you have to do the same thing in financial services, for instance, it's trickier because you have regulation there. So it's country by country by country. So whenever we invest in companies that require little regulation, are somehow addressing the same issue without much peculiarities on a country by
Mm-hmm.
country basis, we push for that regional expansion sooner. When there are more friction points, there's regulation, etc. We try to hold horses and say, hey, you know what? Let's make sure we build something relevant in this market before we go to a next. Because being able to figure out somehow what the problem is in one country does not give you any edge
Right.
in the country in another country. So you need to go and almost start from scratch. So it's case by case. But what is interesting is that at the very beginning, you only had critical mass in Brazil. And then if a business was starting in Brazil, you could say, you know what, remain focused for a while here and then we'll see. But if you remain focused here and you're successful here, that is big enough and you can build a relevant company. But at the time, if you were starting a company in the other markets, even Mexico, you would have said, you know what, you have to be regional from the get-go. Because at the end of the day, why is size so relevant? Because in technology, the relevant piece is that to build something scalable, right? So because it
Mm-hmm.
costs the same to serve a customer or 100 customer or a million customer. I'm exaggerating maybe, but you get the concept, right? So So if you have to build something and you want that something to be successful, you need to serve a significant group of customers for you to be able to get the advantages of economies of scale. So at that time, any company outside of Brazil would have said, you know what, you have to be regional, you have to be regional. Today, obviously, markets have grown, there are more users because of broadband, because of mobile internet, etc. All those users are more intense individually, so they use more whatever service you're selling.
Right.
So certainly today in Mexico, you can build a large company by itself, and slowly but steadily, that's happening also in Colombia and in Argentina. And you mentioned Bolivia in your introduction. Eventually, there'll be a market in Bolivia, and just by staying in Bolivia, you could build a relevant company. But really, again, you need the market to get there in terms of users, in terms of
For sure.
access to internet, access to broadband. But it will happen. So it's case by case. But what we always tell companies is successful companies are built out of strength, so make sure that you somehow secure something. And once you have that, that could be your market or could be an aspect of your technology or something, then plan for the expansion. But do not stretch out too thin,
Hmm.
too fast, because at the end of the day, you're just spreading weaknesses, and that is not what you need to build a successful business. So if you wait, but what you are building is relevant, fine, you have something. If
Hmm.
you go too fast into the expansion plan, but then at the end of the day, you are not relevant anywhere, it looks nice because you have a map with lots of flags. But then when you double click and see what's behind each of those flags, there's nothing. So, uh, but it's tricky. It's tricky, and whenever you have, so where do I invest my next dollar?
Right.
If you keep on applying short-term ROI, the answer is keep on spending that or investing that in your current market. And if that's the case, then you never go regionally. So at some point, you need to break that kind of glass ceiling that you have, but you need to know when is the right time for you. And it's art and science, the answer for
Right.
that.
So one more question as we sort of begin wrapping up here. In the past, we've seen companies that were built from Europe for Latin America, from the US for Latin America. We've been seeing from Latin America for Latin America these big regional players. So, do you think in the next decade, in your role, we'll start seeing more of those from Latin America for the world, similar to perhaps how Chinese companies have gone through that progression as well? Is that something that excites you? What's your thoughts on building from LATAM for the world?
I think it's already happening. Again, obviously, the proportion is many more from Europe to Latin America, many more from Latin America just for Latin America. But slowly but steadily, we're seeing companies. We have one company in our portfolio, Gympass, started in Brazil, addressing a problem that they found in Brazil, that it was this building a platform so companies could provide gym access and in general terms more health access to their employees. And then they realized that they could do that in other parts of the world, so they expanded to Europe and did quite well there. And then they decided to go into the US. So that is happening. In some cases, we
Hmm.
have a couple of companies in our portfolio that have been quite successful expanding into other markets from other of that original market where they started. And now they're planning to go to Europe, many of them. And we have one company even considering entering Asia. So certainly there's a trend there. We have this company, the Not Company, Notco,
Hmm.
that started in Chile with their AI technology to build a non-dairy product, and now they have not milk and not meat, and really amazing product. The quality of what they do is incredible. And the original plan was to be in Chile, then to expand to Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and now they are selling in the US, and they are having offers to expand beyond the US. So yeah, that is happening. I think that technology today is breaking down frontiers and barriers to do that. So yeah, I'm totally confident that that will happen in the future.
Oh, well, and then thank you. Now, very exciting. And also, Notco is a great example of how the ecosystem has transformed. I believe it went through some of the accelerators that Chile built, I think Startup Chile or something else, and obviously to show how the company's matured to go domestic, regional, and perhaps global. So thank you so much for sharing some of your thoughts here. Really excited to have you and to see what other things you'll be cooking out of your portfolio as well.
Well, thank you, Juan, and pleasure to be here. I hope it was an interesting conversation for you and the audience.
Thank you, Hernan.